This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. As a result of the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's decision to stop participating in the 287G program, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, stepped up operations in Charlotte. That instilled fear in the city's immigrant community, which makes up 13% of the population. They demanded action. Mayor Vi Lyles formed a committee to listen to immigrants' concerns and to find ways to make the city more inclusive for its foreign-born residents. The job of taking those findings and turning them into action falls to Federico Rios. He is Charlotte's first International and Integration Manager, and he joins us for the hour. Welcome back to the program. Good to see you.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Larkin Eggleston is also here. He is a city council, Charlotte City Councilman representing District 1 who chairs the Immigrant Community Committee, which is the committee the mayor formed in response to the requests from the immigrant community, and he too is with us. Good morning.
It's an honor.
Unlike your cohort in crime, Tariq Bakari, who sits in the same chair when he comes here, by the way. And Emily Yaffe is an international relations specialist with the city who has been involved in this series of public meetings being held by the Immigrant Community Committee. Welcome to you.
Glad to be here.
Frederick, let me begin with you. In January of last year, you were named the city's first international and integration manager to lead the office. What is your job for people who are not familiar with you or your job? What's your job?
Great question. So International Integration Manager is actually short for International Business and Immigrant Integration Manager. So I lead the Office of International Relations. We serve as a liaison between the immigrant community, the large burgeoning immigrant community we have here in Charlotte, and the city government. My role, actually, though the standing up of my office actually came from recommendations that were had in the Immigrant Integration Task Force. That group reported out in 2015 in relation to how better to integrate our immigrant community here in Charlotte. So I serve as a liaison between that community and city government, ensuring that their needs are being addressed, ensuring that they have a point person in city government that could help work with them.
You may have already answered my second question with that response, but why did the city feel that it was necessary to have somebody like you in a job like yours? Is it simply because the immigrant community heretofore, before 2015, they felt was isolated or kind of siloed in?
Absolutely. I think the Immigrant Integration Task Force was put together really to address the needs of that population. There had been some consistent conversations around how we hadn't taken a holistic look as a city around the needs of that particular population. And so from that, the Office of International Relations was formed. And going back to something you said when we started, 13% of our population is foreign born. And so there's a large group of individuals in our city that we should be reaching out to proactively. And so this office was created for that purpose.
That seems like a large number. Actually surprised me yesterday when I read that number. Do you think most people know that 13% of the population is foreign born here?
I would say to you, and Emily is motioning up, it's actually significantly higher.
How high is it, Emily?
We would estimate closer to 20% now.
Really?
Yeah. And what's even more interesting, in 2016, Pew Research showed that over 33% of our young people, so individuals 18 and younger, are either foreign born or the child of a foreign born parent. So 1/3 of our youth population.
So a big part of your job, as I understand it, is to create and enhance international business connections and to connect with immigrant business owners to help them understand how the city works and what the city can do for them or what they need from the city to facilitate some sort of back and forth two-way communication. Is that accurate?
So there is a facet of my job that relates to that. We have an amazing person on staff within our economic development department, Alexis Gordon, who manages that day-to-day working with international businesses. We do relate a bit more with our small business owners. Again, throwing out some facts, over 30% of Main Street businesses, so when you think of barbershops, nail salons, businesses of that sort are immigrant owned and within the region. So that's a large percentage of individuals in our community that create economic development opportunities within Charlotte.
I would think that much of your job to this point has centered on people who come here on work visas or who have other documentation that they've gone through the system. Perhaps they're here forever because they've passed through the system and They're on the road to citizenship or have become citizens. How do you interface with people who are not here with documentation?
So we work with all of our residents the same. We try to provide them with resources and services and accessibility. I think the biggest focal point of my role is really to ensure that all of our services and resources are accessible to the residents of the city of Charlotte.
So in February, Larkin Eggleston, Mayor Lyles announced the formation of this ad hoc committee, of which you are the chairman, the Immigrant Community Committee. Then she appointed you, Dimple Ajmera, Matt Newton, and James Mitchell to work with Federico over here on facilitating outreach to that community. Given the fear that many people in the immigrant community have of putting their head above the rest of the crowd or stepping outside the front door in some cases, how are you getting to them? How are they getting to you?
I think that we are going to them, and one of the things
Don't they fear you? You're government.
Maybe to some degree, but I think that you can build trust by coming to their community, not asking them. Not everybody's going to feel comfortable coming downtown and coming into the government center for a meeting where we're saying we want to hear their needs, their fears, their concerns, the things that are going on in their community. So we went to them, and one of the 9 community events that we held was out towards the airport at Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. We had almost 250 people there. So these were folks, many of whom were primarily Spanish speakers. We had interpreters there. We had community leaders that we engaged in this work who were able to transfer some of their trust onto us, I think, between us and the community. They were vouching for us, and these were people that the community trusted and said, well, if they're vouching, Federico and Emily had already built a lot of trust in the community. So that transfer of trust, I think, gave the council members a chance, myself included, to be there, to hear kind of their open, honest answers to those questions. And by being in their churches and their community centers and not asking them to come to us, I think we really opened the door to an honest conversation.
Is the reason your committee exists, the reason it was put together by the mayor, is it primarily to respond to the fears instilled by ICE on certain members of mostly the Hispanic or Latino community? Or is it in response to just the general immigrant community of which we have 20% of the population now?
I think yes, and I think it was both. I think certainly the timing of it was prompted by the outpour of emotion that we heard not only from people in the immigrant community, but people in the community at large who said we need to stand behind our immigrant neighbors. And so when Sheriff McFadden removed the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Department from 287G, when the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement agents started kind of ramping up their enforcement and more out in the community than in the jail at that point, there was an outpouring of demand, I'll say, for the council, for the city to step up and support our immigrant community. And so I think that was the timing of it. But what we were seeking to address was not simply the Hispanic community, it was all of our immigrant communities. And we have really strong Indian American and African communities, and from all around the world, we want to know what all of those communities need. And I think that the work and the feedback that we got was much, much broader than just talking about immigrations and customs enforcement.
Well, I was going to ask you, Emily Affe, about that, because you've been doing this for a while for the city as an international relations specialist. The fear that we hear about, the average person, when they hear fear in the immigrant community of ICE, they immediately picture undocumented immigrants of Hispanic origin who probably crossed the southern border. Are there other people from other countries who share similar experiences to those people who are here undocumented, who also fear being rounded up by ICE?
Absolutely. What we know about undocumented immigrants is that many of them are people who have overstayed visas, or there have been issues in keeping their visas up to date. And so that helps us know that there are so many more people beyond just those who cross the southern border who are undocumented in our community. We also know that through changes in temporary protected status and other ways that people enter into the United States, that the look of our undocumented community is diverse. It's as diverse as Charlotte.
One of the things you're trying to do with this committee is to help immigrants understand how our government works, our local city government works, and what services are there for them. And there is a distrust in officials maybe because of where they came from or what is going on under the current administration with ICE. But let me play devil's advocate for just a second here. All three of you work for the city of Charlotte in some capacity. You're a government employee. Why are local governments not enforcing the law? And the law is the federal law with regard to immigration. So when you come into contact with people who are undocumented, why are you helping them stay here? Why aren't you handing them over?
So, loaded question, but you are playing devil's advocate.
It's not a loaded question. It is an honest question that
it is an
people
honest
want to
question.
know the answer to.
I think there's a misperception that we can somehow execute on immigration law. That is within the purview of the federal government. So a good portion of what we did during our time in community was actually spend some time discussing the differences between the federal, state, and local jurisdictions and what their mandates are, what it is that they actually work towards and direct. And so we as a local government do not have the ability to enforce immigration law. We can't send people packing. We have to work with the individuals that work in our community. And we recognize that if we don't hear the voice of undocumented persons, there's a propensity for missing out on a lot of things that we need to know. For instance, what crimes are being committed in those communities and whether or not those individuals have been victims of crime. We've seen a significant reduction in the amount of crimes reported in heavily immigrant communities within Charlotte.
But we're having a national conversation right now
Yes.
about whether or not we really are a country based on the rule of law. And most of that conversation centers around a president who seems to regularly thwart that, or it indicates that that could be the case. Aren't you thwarting the law?
I'd like to add that when you boil down our jobs, it really is about serving residents. And so at the end of things, if you were to look at all city employees, our role in city government is to serve the residents of Charlotte. And if we were to qualify that as who do we consider a resident that's deserving of our services, it really kind of muddies the water in how we can do our job in the best way.
I also think every level of government has a specific job to do. And so one of the things that if you go back to House Bill 2, for instance, the state government in that case essentially said that Charlotte had stepped outside of the bounds of their scope of work. They had done something they didn't have the authority to do, shouldn't have done it, should have been done at the state level. And now we've got a bill in Raleigh that's trying to compel sheriffs to have to be a part of the 287G program. Mm-hmm. I would argue that a local sheriff's department, part of their scope of work is not to enforce federal immigration law. So to me, you can't have it both ways. Either each government body and group has work that they're supposed to do and they should stay in those lanes, or they don't. And now we have two different instances in a pretty short time span where Raleigh says, stay in your lane, do what you're supposed to do and nothing else. And then now are saying, get in someone else's lane and help do federal immigration law enforcement. To me, that's not part of the scope of work of the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Department.
Okay. So this committee, the job of this committee is to listen and learn from the immigrant community, not just those in the Hispanic or Latino community, but all of and we have people from all over the world here, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, who are not just those who are fearful of ICE. I only have a second left, but are both groups equally in need of action on their behalf by the city?
Absolutely. All of our community members need our services and resources.
Okay. We'll come back and talk more about that, and we'll talk about who these immigrants are, because they're from all over the world. When we come back in a moment, it's Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes this morning from WFAE members and the new Asbury Health and Rehabilitation Center at Aldersgate, a shift from institutional care to neighborhood living. Details at aldersgatehealthcare.com. And the Cabarrus Arts Council presenting the Freddie Cole Quartet on April 30th at the Davis Theater. Freddie Cole, the brother of Nat King Cole, offers jazz with piano, vocals, and brass in a swing style. Details and tickets at cabarrusartscouncil.org. On the next Charlotte Talks, young people are on the front lines in raising concerns over climate change, and we will meet some local young teens who are part of a global movement to encourage leaders to take action on the warming planet, and then the impact of the amount of food wasted in the U.S. One estimate says we toss out 40% of our food, and it goes on to feed the landfills. A look at what's being done about that when Charlotte Talks, tomorrow morning at 9 here on 90.7 WFAE.
Hi, I'm Sean Fox.
And I'm Bryant Allen.
Our podcast, Next Door Docs, is one of the 5 finalists in WFAE's Queen City PodQuest, the search for Charlotte's next great podcast.
Learn more about our podcast and find out who will win a podcast development deal with WFAE at the PodQuest Live finale, Saturday, May 4th at the NASCAR Hall of Fame.
Tickets and information at wfae.org/Queen City PodQuest.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about our immigrant community and the city's efforts to integrate them more successfully into the mainstream of Charlotte, because they comprise 20% of the population, we are told this morning, by Emily Yaffe, who's an international relations specialist with the city of Charlotte. Larkin Eggleston is here. He's the District 1 City Councilman chairing the Immigrant Community Committee for Charlotte City Council, and Federico Rios is International Business and Immigration Integration Manager for the city of Charlotte. Immigration is a national problem, but communities across America are the ones struggling to deal with the consequences of national inaction on immigration reform. What exactly can a city, what exactly can Charlotte do in the face of inaction on immigration policy at the federal level, and in the face of some Trump administration policies that many view as pretty severe?
So 2 things. One, I do think there's the political will in Washington to implement immigration reform.
Where is it?
Well, we were sitting...
I've been doing this show for 21 years now, and we've talked about this problem for 21 years, and not a thing has happened.
That's completely fair, and I'm not overly optimistic that it actually makes it across the finish line, unfortunately. But we were sitting in the office of Republican Richard Hudson, and a member of Congress, just a month or 2 ago. This is a Republican. He represents Concord and kind of east from there. And he, a conservative Republican, said, we really thought we were going to get it across the finish line in this last term. He was really disappointed that they didn't. I do think that most of Congress wants to see comprehensive immigration reform. I'm sure they all have different definitions of what that ultimately ends up looking like, but he was very frustrated that I perceived that he kind of felt like the executive branch was the hurdle there that they just couldn't get over.
Well, there's been many executive branches, not just the Trump executive. It was the Obama, it was the George W. Bush executive branch. It's been going on for a long time. And everybody, to a person says that I've talked to, that we have we have a great need for immigration reform. We need to do it, and they don't do it. So why? We have this great divide in the country between Republican and Democrat, left and right, conservative, liberal, whatever you want to call them. You do a podcast with your Republican counterpart on City Council, Tariq Bakari. How do you get along if nobody else in Washington can get along and even decide simple things that they both agree need to happen?
I actually do. I think people probably get along in Raleigh and Washington more than they let on. Tarek and I, hosting our podcast R&D and the QC, we get a lot of
Good
grief.
Plug.
Thank you. We get a lot of grief from our respective sides of the aisle for being buddies with somebody from the other party. I think there are people in Washington and in Raleigh who genuinely like each other and behind the scenes probably get along and have productive dialogues, but realize that it might not be politically favorable for them to be open about those relationships. At the same time, I think the original question was, what can the city do? We realize that it's not our role to implement immigration reform. That's far out of our lane. But what we have done is tried to say, how can we be a welcoming city? How can we be the global city that we want to be, and make sure that everyone has access to what we're doing? That's part of the reason that we started every one of these community sessions with going through, not only for the immigrant community, but for the community at large, who the general population of Charlotte also doesn't understand what the city does, what the county does, what the state and federal governments do. So part of it was framing the discussion to say, first you have to understand whose job each of these things is. And here's what the city can and can't do, because when the ICE raids started after 287G was removed, one of the main things we heard was the city of Charlotte needs to tell ICE to get out of town. We can't do that. And so we needed to be very honest with people about what our capabilities are and what our limitations are. So that's how we framed every one of those discussions, was here's what we can do. Now let's talk within that framework about what would be beneficial.
We're talking about, go ahead.
I was just going to add, just to give you, Mike, and listeners kind of an overview of what we did. So we went out, we did a presentation on the differences between the different types of government, and then we had a conversation. We really listened to community members and asked, well, what are the challenges you are facing? And we put it in the appropriate bucket. If it's fear of immigration and customs enforcement, that's under the federal government. Mm-hmm. If it's a challenge related to mental health resources, that really is dictated by the state. And so as we collected these challenges, we then broke off and said, okay, these are the items that our council persons can advocate for as an agenda. And these are the things within the purview of the city government that we really want to hear your voice even deeper on. And so then we went into a participatory policymaking approach, where we sat community members down and asked them to formulate policy that they then would recommend to city council. So we took a really different approach. We didn't just go out and listen. We really proactively asked them to inform us on the things that they wanted to hear. One of the challenges we consistently have, I think, not speaking for the councilman, but thinking about this in context, is oftentimes we get complaints. As a city government, we hear the challenges that people face. That doesn't necessarily directly lead to the formation of policy. Mm-hmm. So we said, help us with this translation, if you will. Help us translate your challenges into policy.
We'll talk about what kind of policy proposals they put forward. When we talk about the immigrant community and fear in the community and what's led to the formation of this council, it usually dates back to 287G and our new sheriff deciding not to participate any longer with that, and ICE stepping up their raids. But Emily, you talk to these folks in the immigrant community every day and have been for a long time. Is that their primary concern, or are there other things that they are concerned about?
I think fear often comes to the forefront of people's minds, but when you have a longer discussion, you'll hear more. And what we heard a lot from people was that there was this disconnect between understanding what services were being provided by local government, how to get involved, and then not actually getting out to the community so that the community could then participate in it. And then we also heard at every single meeting was that people wanted to be part of making this community better. And that was really powerful thing, because we talk a lot about how we serve residents. But then we had residents come and tell us that they wanted to serve the government. And that just means a lot when you talk with individuals.
Do you hear that from by and large, the other 80% of our community, how they want to serve the government? Do you hear that from them? You don't interface with them. Do you hear that from them, Larkin?
I think everybody wants to be involved in their government. And I think the more we do to educate the entire population about how they can get involved, about what each body of government is responsible for, people can find something that they're passionate about and plug into it. For me, my formal involvement with the city before I was on city council was I served on 2 advisory boards, one of which was the Charlotte International Cabinet that I chaired for 2 terms. I was there in leadership of that group when we created the Immigrant Integration Task Force that ultimately led to us hiring Federico. So when you can have something that you're passionate about and you can impact policy and impact the direction of the city, I think most everyone who's got the time to be able to do that would like to be a part of the direction of this city, and we need to be better about opening that door to people and letting them know how they can engage.
So we have, Federico, we have people here from all over the world. We have the bulk of our population is Hispanic origin, but we have people here from China, Vietnam, India, Germany. Have I missed anybody? I must have.
Pretty much everywhere.
You missed a lot of people.
A lot of people.
But when you think of the top 5 populations in regards to foreign nationality, when you think about nationality, our second largest national group are Indians. So we have a really large Indian population here in Charlotte.
Is that because we're a banking and technology city?
Absolutely. And most of the Indian population has come through H-1B visas. When you think about, from a federal standpoint, the changes to that policy, there is fear in that community about how that will impact their livelihood and their ability to provide for themselves and their families. Our 5th largest is our Vietnamese population, a population that really is our first refugee population here in Charlotte. That has been coming since the late 70s, early 80s.
You mentioned H-1B visas, and several years ago we did a program about H-1B visas and what that means, who that brings into the country, and what that means for people who live here. And there is a I don't want to call it a misconception, but there are people think that the folks coming in on H-1B visas, particularly those in the technology sector, are taking jobs away from people who are natural-born citizens who could do those jobs, but they're bringing these folks in at low wage for a a year or 18 months or 2 years, and they're just rotating in and out, depriving people of jobs. Is that true?
I mean, there's competing narratives in this. There's the dialogue that immigrants come to take, and there's also the position that regionally we don't have certain talents readily available that we need to access as a
What's
community.
the truth?
I think the truth is somewhere in between both. I think with any set of narratives, you have to look at both things and kind of determine what it is that really makes sense. I think we have a dearth of opportunities that are not readily accessed here in Charlotte. We have many positions that stay open in the banks, in government, and other opportunities. And H-1B visas are an opportunity to fill those things. We have some amazing staff on the city level that are H-1B visa recipients that have done an amazing job. We as a city are standing up a policy, or attempting to, through our Human Resources Department, to ensure that those hard-to-fill positions can be filled with H-1B visa recipients.
So one of the things that you hope will come out of these meetings that have been held is that the immigrant community who comes to the meetings wants to have a better understanding of how things work and what the city can and cannot do. What is the reaction, Emily, when people come to these meetings and they begin to understand the limits of the city of Charlotte's power?
It felt like most people were very understanding of it. We didn't start a conversation with, we can't do this, because that kind of cuts things off and makes people feel like we're not there even listening. So we level set about what our powers are, and then talked about what the role is that we can play in these other areas that the city doesn't have a direct role in. But then really focused in on what can we do. We can talk about how people can access city services in other languages. We can talk about building bridges between local government and residents and building leadership capacity.
So you talk to these folks every day, but you're also attending these meetings, as I understand it, in your capacity as an international relations specialist. What's the takeaway? What seems to be the big takeaway from these meetings for the attendees, for people who come, who want to offer their own words of advice, but also want to listen to you guys? What's been the takeaway for them?
That we're interested in meeting with them. We held some of these meetings in English, and we held some of them in Spanish. And so just the act of speaking in the language that is preferred by many of our community members, their most well-spoken language, and having staff members that are able to do that was really powerful and really showed that we are there for them, rather than requiring them to come to a government building, requiring them to listen to a meeting in a language that isn't as easily understood. We really said that we are here for you, and really lived that into existence with the way we held these meetings.
And you were telling me off the air, Federico, that somebody in the German-speaking community asked if the live stream of these meetings was going to be in German, and I almost laughed out loud because I thought that was not impossible. That's an impossible thing, but you made it happen.
Yeah.
How?
Our communications department is amazing. Our GovChannel folks did an amazing job of being able to access some resources to get translated closed caption on some of our meetings. And so as community members come to us and want to be able to hear in their own language, this actually afforded us the opportunity to test out some things we haven't done before. We did simultaneous interpretation during these sessions. So as Emily led the charge in talking about the differences between government, individuals were able to hear it in their own languages. We also turned the tables so that council members had to wear headsets and get that experience of having something translated into their ear.
Well, that's my next question. What are you learning from this, Larkin and Federico and Emily? What are you learning from the people coming to these meetings?
We learned a lot, and I think that one of the big things that just came up over and over and over again was about the city's communication methods, styles, the way we give people access to the work we're doing, to the services we provide. It was really eye-opening, as Federico just mentioned, for us to be able to have a headset on and hear translation in real time from Spanish, where the meeting was being led in Spanish, into English, into our ears. I think we learned how valuable it is to have bilingual employees. Federico and Emily are both bilingual, and we're able to communicate with people in both languages, and that's an incredible asset to our city government when we have a workforce that represents a diversity of backgrounds, a diversity of ethnicities, and speaks a diversity of languages. There's a lot of things. A lot of what we heard was that people wanted us to make statements about our support of the community. I think individually we've done that. I think there's opportunity for us to collectively do something like that coming out of this work of this committee. But really it was about, we don't feel like the way you're communicating doesn't tell us that you want us to be involved in what you're doing. It doesn't tell us you want us to be a part of the work of the city. And so one of the things we have come out with from this is going to be a language access plan. And I think that will open the door to a lot more people to engage.
I'm sure that people who come to this meeting, particularly from the Hispanic community who are undocumented, if in fact they're coming as undocumented people, don't identify themselves as such, so you have no idea who is and who isn't at these meetings. But is it possible to integrate into our community undocumented immigrants? Is it possible for them to be fully participatory in what goes on here, given what could happen if their status is revealed?
People do it every day. We have people who go shopping at local grocery stores. Their children go to our schools, and they're part of our community every single day in so many different ways.
I think invariably those individuals cannot vote, but their voice can be heard in really unique ways. We did have some individuals that shared with us that their status was in question, that they had some challenges in relation to status, but that they still wanted to ensure that they were connected, that they were providing, going back to Councilmember Eggleston's statement from earlier, that they were really connected to the city and providing themselves over to serve as a resource.
I guess one of our growing pains in Charlotte is becoming more of a city of the world as opposed to an isolated outpost somewhere in the Mid-South. And we are becoming this international community. If you have 20% of your population from all over the world, you're becoming an international community. We do not have signage on our roads in anything other than English for the most part. We don't really. How does the city do in terms of pamphlets that they hand out in English or papers that you have to fill out to do whatever you have to do with a piece of paper? How many of those are in multiple languages?
You perfectly teed up Emily for that question, and I want her to answer it. But I want to say that I don't think that becoming a global international city is a growing pain. I think it's something that we need to and that we do celebrate.
We have many departments who already choose to provide their services in other languages. So if you go on a CATS bus and there's a route change, you will see that that information is provided in Spanish and oftentimes other languages as well. But through these dialogues with the community, we've seen a lot of support and need for creating a larger, broader language access plan for the city of Charlotte. So extending a lot of how we do business and providing language services to all of our departments and helping all of them understand how they can provide interpretation, translate any document that introduces a service to clients, and do that readily.
I'm going to come back and talk more about that and about how bilingual some of the departments that ordinary people interface with, like the police and fire departments, et cetera, how bilingual they are and how easy it is to communicate with them if the officer responding to you doesn't speak a language other than English. How quickly can they get a translation? We'll talk about that and other things when we come back at Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and the North Carolina Turnpike Authority, offering NC Quick Pass for commuters traveling the I-77 express lanes. Details for NC Quick Pass transponders, maps, and more at ncquickpass.com. And Wake Forest University's Bioethics Graduate Program, engaged in clinical and research ethics and health policy. Full and part-time applications for its master's and certificate programs are available at wfu.edu/bioethics. Over the past few years, doctors have discovered the fungal infection Candida auris in patients around the world, and they've noticed something else. The fungus resists many types of treatment. The CDC estimates that nearly 600 cases have been reported in the U.S., and nearly half of those with the illness have died within 90 days. In the 11 o'clock hour of 1A, a conversation about what can be done to eliminate this harmful fungus.
Former Nightline host Ted Koppel is the special guest at WFAE's annual dinner on Thursday, June 6th at the Charlotte Convention Center. He'll talk with WFAE CEO Joe O'Connor about the state of journalism and the health of our nation's democracy. Tickets for this event are going fast. Get details and learn about sponsorship opportunities at WFAE.org. An Evening with Ted Koppel is sponsored by SunTrust.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about immigration and the role that immigrants play in our city and the role the city is playing in terms of trying to more successfully integrate those immigrants, which make up 20% of our population, into the city as a whole. And to that end, the mayor created this Immigrant Community Committee, of which Larkin Eggleston, who represents District 1 on City Council, is the chair. He is with us this morning, along with Emily Yaffe, International Relations Specialist for the city, and Federico Rios, International Business and Immigrant Integration Manager for the city of Charlotte. We were talking about language a second ago and how successfully Charlotte and how far along the way Charlotte is with regard to making pamphlets and rules and forms and papers and people who you have to go get a marriage license from or whatever, speaking multiple languages, because we have all these different languages. And I'm curious about how many of the people that people most often intersect with, the police and fire department, there are probably others that the average citizen intersects with most, how many of them are bilingual or multilingual or have access to help translating immediately?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually something we repeatedly heard in these community conversations, how many individuals can speak other languages. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we asked for last night in the dinner briefing was for City Council to consider endorsing the city manager's review, a full assessment of our current bilingual capability. We are doing a language survey citywide for our staff, over 8,000 people, to determine what capabilities we currently have. In regards to CMPD, we have CMPD of all departments probably has the most individuals that are bilingual. We don't have that information yet. We've made a data request. We know that they have 77 Latino officers. We can infer that a percentage of those Latino officers do speak Spanish. We have made a specific request to ask how many other languages are spoken in the department. We want to ensure, not only with CMPD, but with all of our departments, that we're building cultural concierges, that we're really looking at what resources do we have in-house that we can better leverage to serve as points of contact for the community members that they represent.
We also know that our CMPD officers receive training on how to use interpretation services. So if they're out in the field and they're helping a family that doesn't speak English, there are call-in services that they can use.
What about cultural competency? Because there's a difference between language and culture.
Yeah, they do receive cultural competency training as well. I'm not sure how what that looks like. I haven't looked into that, but we do know that our officers do go through that type of training.
But I also think that, and you said the word immediately, that people can interact immediately, and I think that is, while it's important that all of our departments have folks that can speak other languages. I think CMPD and Charlotte Fire, it has to be even more of a priority, because they don't have the time to necessarily tap into a service or go find somebody. They've got something, as you said, immediately that they've got to deal with. Someone's in crisis. So it's critically important that for fire and police that we try to expand that language access.
How do you do that? Aside from Google Translate, how do you do that?
Well, I think in your hiring practices, and we already have an incentive for Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department for people who speak another language. I think we can potentially expand that to other departments. But I also just think that increasing the diversity of the people that you're hiring will bring more cultural competency. If a department better reflects, any of our departments better reflect the community at large, I think they will be more understanding of the community at large. They'll have that better cultural competency, like you said.
Your job, Federico, came about because of the 2015 Immigration Integration Task Force recommendations, and you've been trying to, I guess, implement many of those recommendations for the last 4 years. This new series of meetings now puts more on your plate. Are you still working on the recommendations from 2015?
Yes, sir. Those recommendations, we have updated them, and they now reflect our 5-year strategic plan for the Office of International Relations.
One of the goals resulting from that 2015 task force was to make Charlotte a, quote, gateway city for immigrants, and there were suggestions on how to make that happen. First, why did we want to be a gateway city? What does it mean to be a gateway city, and what has become of the recommendations on how we might become one?
Well, to go back to an earlier data point, we're close to 20% of our population being immigrant community members. And so we recognize that we already are a gateway city.
What does that mean, gateway?
So Brookings Institute, which stated that we were a burgeoning gateway city, one of the fastest growing gateway cities, is that immigrants no longer just come to New York City or no longer just come to Philadelphia or Miami. They come to new gateway cities like ourselves, Nashville, Tennessee, Atlanta.
How do they even know about us?
Well, if you think about what big business is in Charlotte, construction is a huge, huge business driver here in Charlotte. And so a lot of immigrants, by word of mouth, tell other immigrants who come and work in those industries as subcontractors often. If you know the history of Charlotte, you know that Bank of America Tower was built by Mexican immigrants from Houston, Texas, who came as subcontractors for contracting firms that were tasked with building that building. From that point forward, almost every major tower in the city of Charlotte was built by immigrants, Central American and Mexican immigrants primarily.
Wouldn't the same be true of most of the suburbs out in South Charlotte?
I would believe so. I mean, they take up a large share of our immigrant population. In fact, when we were first hearing from community members as they came to City Council to talk about immigration and custom enforcement raids, one of the data points that was relayed was that over 30% of the subcontractors in the city of Charlotte are actually Latino individuals.
So there is talk among certain quarters that these people come in, whether they're legal or not, and they take away jobs. If the Bank of America building was built by Latinos out of Texas, did they take away jobs from people who would have had them otherwise, who are native born?
I think a lot of these jobs, people aren't bringing in folks if there are folks here that can and will fill those jobs. Second, I can tell you, wearing a different part of our city council hat, when we deal with economic development, we're recruiting large companies to come here, move their headquarters, open a headquarters, or open a big, have a big presence here in Charlotte. One of the things we constantly hear is that we don't have as deep a bench of talent in certain fields as some of the people that we're competing with to get these companies. Mm-hmm. So the companies are telling us. It's not a matter of do we think. They are telling us you don't have as deep a pool of talent in a lot of the fields that we're trying to fill jobs in as some of the folks that are also on the list that we're considering.
What are they looking for that we don't have?
Well, one of the things we hear a lot is that we don't have as deep a bench in terms of tech talent. And so we're losing out companies and job opportunities to other markets because we don't have that deep bench of tech talent. So there are people that they are bringing in, not because you said something earlier to the effect that maybe they can pay them less. I don't think they're bringing them in because they can pay them less. I think they're bringing them in because they can't find enough of them here always.
The 2015 task force, the recommendations that came out of the 2015 task force, are we comparing apples and oranges to what's coming out of these series of meetings that the city has, what you're learning from the city, the series of meetings that the city has been conducting? Is it apples and oranges, or do they play off each other?
I think they complement one another. I think so just to take into context, we're talking about a report that was presented to City Council in 2015.
Right.
We're in 2019, and even though it's been 4 years, there have been drastic changes in immigration, both on the federal and local level. And so we recognize that some of those changes reverberate with community members, and we had to update some of those things. I think it's also important to say, just because we listened to community members through the end of 2013 until 2015 when that report was done, we don't stop listening. And so really, what we did through this opportunity was listen again and make sure that we're consistently hearing from community members.
So the charge, Larkin, is to listen and then to turn what you're hearing into policy if you think that's where we ought to go. And I think it was Emily who mentioned that a lot of these folks are coming with their writing policy in the room and handing it over. What do you hear? What kind of policies are being proposed by the immigrant community?
Yeah, we started all these sessions telling people we want to co-create solutions with the community. We want to hear what you need, and then we want to work with you to come up with the solutions for those things. So we mentioned, and Emily dug into a little bit, the language access plan. I think that was the thing that rose to the top at almost every meeting was communications, access, and language. So that we've heard from a lot of people in the community that they want a stronger statement from the city. We think we can broaden that. There are examples.
Stronger statement of what?
Stronger statement of support for the immigrant community than they felt like they got in the wake of the ICE raids. So while many of us individually made statements to that effect, I think we have
Well, the county made their own statement. The county commission made a statement, a clear statement of support for the immigrant community. City Council did not. Why?
Not formally and not collectively. Again, I think a lot of us did individually, but I think we see an opportunity here to emulate what's been done in some other states in a bipartisan fashion, where not only the government, local government and state government in some of these states has come together to collectively loudly say we support our immigrant community.
What does that mean, though, in the end, when you say we loudly support our immigrant community? Of course you do.
Well, I think we have to show that through
that
action, and that was the point, I think, of there not being a knee-jerk statement in the wake of those ICE raids. Was Mayor Lyles said, I don't want to be about talk, I want to be about action. What the community told us was, we need the action, but we also want to hear you using your platform and your voice to tell us that you support us. We need to hear that. And it's not just, if you're at home, it's not just show me you love me, it's tell me you love me. People need both of those things. And so for us, I think we realize we see an opportunity to bring the business community into this as well and say, this is something that is about who Charlotte's values, about who Charlotte is, and make a stronger statement than we could have just as a knee-jerk reaction as a city council.
Are you there yet? Are you ready to make that statement?
We're very close, and so we're going to have 6 days from now, we'll have the final meeting of this ad hoc committee that the mayor created, and on May 13th, we will bring forward to council a set of policy recommendations for council to vote on and hopefully adopt.
And that would be the statement.
That would be
not just
that would
a
be,
sentence saying we support you. It would
no,
be action.
it would be a Charlotte compact, and again, this would emulate what's been done in other states in a bipartisan
These
fashion.
are called. I didn't know this term until yesterday. These are called immigration compacts, and they've been floated and sometimes implemented in other cities and other states around the country for a while now. They emphasize support for immigrant families and recognize the need for immigration reform with a path forward for undocumented immigrants, and they stress the need for attracting and retaining international talent. That's what you're considering doing?
I think it could potentially be broader than that still, but between the Language Access Plan, the Charlotte Compact, we're going to be rolling out our Civic Leadership Academy in Spanish now, making that available starting this year. So there's going to be a whole package of policy recommendations that we bring forward, and my hope is that we will have unanimous bipartisan support on the council to move all those things forward at the city.
Given the lack of inertia, if that's the right term, in Washington on immigration reform, is it like spitting into the wind to enact these immigration compacts that call for a path forward for undocumented immigrants when there clearly doesn't seem to be any way to make that happen in Washington?
Well, I think just because you can't do everything doesn't mean you shouldn't do something. And I also think that as there is more of a concentrated, as there's more of a consensus among people all across our state and all across our nation that something has to be done at a federal level, that pressure will eventually force them to take action, I think. And so we've got to lend our voice to that chorus.
If Charlotte were to do this, Federico, would we be the first municipality in North Carolina to have an immigration compact?
Yes, and to my knowledge, we would be the first municipality, period. The compacts that have been put in place have been done by 4 states, all bipartisan approaches. So Utah, Texas, Iowa, and Florida have all enacted compacts, starting actually 10 years ago with Utah's compact.
Given the great love that comes out of Raleigh for Charlotte, if Charlotte were to enact this immigration compact, wouldn't they just bat it down?
I can tell you that in my experience, my colleague that you mentioned earlier, Tariq Bakari, and I co-chair the Intergovernmental Relations Committee for the city. I can tell you that in the last 16 months or so, Mayor Lyles has rebuilt bridges in Raleigh and Washington that were pretty well burned prior to her arrival as mayor. There's a level of trust, I think, and a level of dialogue between the city and our state and federal government now that doesn't seem to have existed prior to her.
But if you have a legislature who wants to is considering a bill that would force sheriffs statewide to enforce 287G, something our sheriff and other sheriffs in other urban areas have decided not to do, this compact might be seen as flying in the face of those efforts.
It might, but I'm not sure that bill forcing sheriffs to participate in 287G is ultimately going to go into law, because the Sheriff's Association has already come out pretty vocally against that, and the Sheriff's Association carries a lot of weight, particularly with some of the more conservative, more rural legislators. And so I think that, again, they see it as an attack on local control. And I think the Republican Party has often said that government closest to the people is the most effective and knows best what the people need. I agree with that sentiment, and I think that local sheriffs...
But that hasn't been their approach to Charlotte.
Well, I hope that is shifting, and I hope that that's changing, and that there can be more of a dialogue now. And our intent is not to propose anything that flies in the face of state law or that gets out of Charlotte's lane, gets out of municipal government's lane. We were very mindful that anything we put forward would be very scrutinized, and that we needed to be careful about that so that we didn't undermine our efforts by doing something that Raleigh felt compelled to slap down.
You've mentioned in the past that Charlotte is very, very good at studying problems and issuing 500-page reports on those problems, which then sit on shelves and have to be dusted frequently but never opened. Your committee is holding these 8 sessions to listen and learn and formulate recommendations. How likely are any of them to be implemented?
I think they're almost certain that some of them will be implemented. And to your point of lengthy studies and then large reports that sit on shelves, from the time that these ICE raids started to occur to the time that we'll ask City Council to take up these recommendations will be inside of 90 days, I believe. And so that was part of the mayor's charge when she asked the 3 of us to lead this committee was we want this to be done quickly. We want action to be taken. This shouldn't be all talk, and it shouldn't be over a long, extended period of time. We need action now.
And this wraps up when?
So next Monday will be our final committee meeting, and then on May 13th, the committee will present a package of recommendations to the council to vote on.
Larkin Eggleston is the District 1 representative on City Council. He chairs the Immigrant Community Committee for the council, taking up all of these recommendations and interfacing with the immigrant community. Emily Yaffe does it every day as an international relations specialist, and Federico Rios is the International Business and Immigrant Integration Manager for the city. Thank you all.
Charlotte Talk.